Warm welcome to Oslo and the public library, the Deichman Library here in the heart of Oslo, and this talk about responsibility, arranged by Voksenåsen, Swedish-Norwegian Cultural Center, and Norwegian's national gift to Sweden. Responsibility in building a common history, which everyone can come to accept. Responsibility in how we build a good and well-functioning society, and who should do it. And also our personal responsibility in how we act to pass the history on. The two persons here to talk about this with me is Elisabeth Åsbrink, Swedish author. Welcome. You have written a lot about the history of individuals in relation to the history of the common world, you can also say. I think about the Second World War and in Vienna the trees still remain. The post-war period in 1947, where you also put a finger on the start of the neo-Nazism of today, and you have also written your own family history and family secrets, you can say, in abandonment in relation to the common Jewish history that go back as long as to the 1400th century. The other person I want to welcome is Jørgen Watne Frydnes. Welcome. CEO for Utøya since 2011, and since this year a member of the Norwegian Nobel Committee and also a board member of the Norwegian Helsinki Committee. Welcome. The 22nd of July this summer, exactly 10 years since the terror struck Norway, with first a bomb in the government quarter here in Oslo, and then the massacre at AUF, Workers' Youth League's camp at Utøya. You did a talk in NRK's P2's summer program, Jørgen, where you told how you worked with the rebuilding or not rebuilding of Utøya after a massacre 10 years ago, and the lesson you have learned. And you have also written a book on the same matter, No Man is an Island. What is the most important thing that you learned from the work with the rebuilding?
The most important thing, I mean, there's a lot of things to learn, but I think it's crucial to take with us the importance of actually talking to each other. That without talking to each other, also on the most difficult tasks, the difficult conversations, the most, conversations filled with emotions, we need to also address those issues. We need to talk to each other. Even though it could be difficult conversations, it's definitely something we have to talk about. So, yeah, I think one of the crucial parts is to see each other and talk to each other.
And how do you create a common understanding when we have a completely different experience on what happens? I mean, if you look at Utøya, there are people still alive and there are people mourning their kids.
Well, what we bring in as part of our society today, with the memories, the histories, I think the willingness to actually contribute into that discussion is what creates a good common understanding. If we don't want to have those conversations, if we avoid them because it's too painful or it's too difficult, I think we will, in time, create the situation which will exaggerate the difficulties, not deal with them. So to have an open discussion, even though it's hard, even though it's painful, that is crucial also to build a common understanding of why it's important. And it's not only about finding the answers. It's not only about finding a common understanding, but it's a common understanding which is broad enough to take different perspectives into consideration. I think that's a crucial part.
I think this is something you are into as well in your writing, Elisabeth, telling stories of many people and situations and weave them together.
Well, a part of what I do when I write is I want to fight this idea that the history is something that is behind us. Because that is an illusion, I think. It's an illusion when it comes to our private history, but also the collective history. If we sort of think that, oh, no, that door is closed, that doesn't affect us anymore, what happened then, we are blind when we're trying to find solutions to what we're dealing with today. Because of course, things that happened to us in our private lives or in the history of the societies, they still have effect. And if we don't see that, we are making ourselves, we're taking power from ourselves and we're making ourselves helpless. And so this is what I try to do in my books, try to, sew like a seamstress, sew the past with the present and connect them.
And that's also a huge responsibility. What kind of responsibility do you feel when it comes to persons in the books, both the living and the dead, and telling their story in your way?
Well, I mean, in a sense, we work with similar themes because it's about memory and about putting a stop to oblivion in a way through knowledge and through putting words to things, if I understand you correctly. No, I think I want to pick up certain individuals from the oblivion of the past, and it can be people who've done very good things, or it can be perpetrators, or it could be just people who embellish or embody the time, the zeitgeist, if you wish. So it's all a part of this work of trying to understand the present through knowledge about the past. And this is also connected to, of course, what happened in Oslo. The terrorist he didn't invent his ideas himself. They were there. They've been there historically. They were part of what the Hitler Nazism became after the war, when it transformed itself into another ideology. And so if we know history, we can understand the present. That is a very basic truth.
And what difference can you see when it comes to handle the history of trauma, a long time ago and recently happened? The similarity and the difference in that, you say?
Well, of course, when time goes, you can probably deal with it in a different way because they're no longer, as present in everyday life. But still, I think the principle of how you deal with it is the same. We're still talking about people. To tell another person's story, you have to treat them with that respect, even though it's present or past. So I totally agree that you can't treat history only as history. You can't say that's something of the past, so we should do differently today. For us at Utøya, and how to deal with the aftermath of a terrorist attack is about telling the story of what happened. So if you want to create a meaningful future for a place which is the scene of a horrific terrorist attack, you can do that probably in many ways, but you do have an obligation to tell what happened. And if you try to undermine, if you try to kind of take away the brutal history, then the future will no longer, I think, be able to bear. So to be able to create the meaningful future, you also have to tell the story as it was, and that, in our case, is a brutal history. But I really think that is also the honesty in the history telling is important for new generations to understand.
But how much of that did you understand when you started your job with rebuilding or not rebuilding? Because it wasn't so clear that you were. It
wasn't clear at all. I mean, when we started this, I think it's important to understand that my job and the leadership of the Labour Party's youth organization, AUF. I was 26 years old when I started this, and I was the veteran. So here, talking about Utøya, talking about the labor youth, it's a generation, it's a young, mainly young people. And if you look now 10 years on, Utøya is a place full of life. Utøya is a place where memory is balanced, goes hand in hand with new generations' activities. So I think the use of the word balance is most likely the word I've been using the most for the last 10 years. But it's all generated by quite young people. And we didn't know what to do. As one American professor asked me quite early on, what are the traditions of Norway to dealing with such a terrorist attack? And of course the answer to that question is we do not have any traditions. We don't have the answers. So we had to find those answers ourselves. But going into those questions without any experience, without any prior knowledge, was also a way of seeking that knowledge. If you want to learn, first you have to listen. And before you can lead a process, you have to do those things. Listen and learn first. So for us it was a brutal way of learning, but it was still, I would say that if you compare it to what the government of Norway have been able to do with dealing with the trauma of 22nd of July, is not very impressive. But what the young generations have been able to do, I would definitely, in all modesty, say it's a completely different thing.
Could I ask you what are the differences? What are you referring to?
Well, there have been major debates in Norway how to create a memorial, how should we deal with the scars of 22nd of July as part of rebuilding the governmental center. The choices made has always been the easy way out. And to always go with the easy way out has created tons of problems. While we went kind of the other way, saying this will be a process full of conflict, full of emotions, but this is the nature of life after a terrorist attack. And so we kind of basically just jumped into it. It hasn't been easy, and we really need to do it with respect. But what we did was basically two things. We realized that we don't have the answers ourselves, so we created a group full of expertise from around the world. Maybe the most kind of known persons or people from this group is Alice Greenwald, which is the director of the 9/11 Memorial Museum in New York. So we have the expertise, but I would still say that the most crucial part, which I guess you can relate to, is to talk to those affected. So in my job for the last 10 years, it's been, yes, being the CEO of Utøya, leading the process, but I contacted each and every family that lost one of their loved ones. Talked to them on the phone, hours and hours, eventually traveling to their homes, meeting them over a cup of coffee or in their house. And I think to be able to meet, to have the circle of those that were most affected first, take them into consideration first, even though there were plenty of difficult conversations, hard conversations, difficult feedback for us to handle, that we did that we saw the individuals, listened to them, and then took the steps further on. That's the big difference between the way of the government, of the state basically, and what we did at Utøya.
But it also means that, as we were talking about, not everyone can be satisfied with exactly everything. And that's just the same when you talk about Utøya or when you talk about how we talk about our history that we not are supposed to forget. Because you start to talk about that in your book 1947, because it's not just what we talk about, but what we choose not to focus on. I think that can be important, and you write about that, Elisabeth. And you one thing you bring up is the fact that there was an aid to help Nazis and war criminals, both to hide and to be incorporated in the new Germanys, you could say, and that no one of the new ruling countries wanted to dig too deep in that thing after the war. How big impact do you think that had on what happened in Oslo and Utøya 64 years later? I mean, we're talking about building up a new
I think it's
Europe.
I mean, it's also, we shouldn't make things too easy. I wouldn't say that there's a direct connection, but there are a lot of connections. I think how I would describe it is that we have had a kind of illusion that 1945, when the war was declared over, the ideology of Nazism and of Jew hatred, that they disappeared, that they were defeated as well. But of course they weren't. And what I describe in this book, 1947, is how actually with the Swedish fascist leader as a main character, there is a network where all these little fragments of Nazi and fascist ideology in all the separate countries, they were actually tied together through him, and the ideologies developed, and they were radicalized and modernized, and they were merged with new ideas about ethnic sovereignty, when the ideas of anti-colonialism came into people's minds in the 60s and the 70s, and all this actually formed into an idea of these people, of a white Europe as a white continent with no foreign elements. Foreign elements is their words, not mine. And they named these foreign elements, and they were, of course, Jews and black people and Muslims. This is what was considered foreign elements. And this ideology hasn't just appeared out of nowhere. It grew out of the old school Hitler Nazism. And it also became merged, as I said, with anti-colonialism. So the terrorists in Oslo, I mean, if we should understand how this came to be, in one sense at least, we have to look to the past, and we have to see that, for instance, these ideologies, they're not sprung out of unhappy childhoods or personal psychology. They are in our society, and we need to name them and define them and see them in order to fight them, because they are anti-democratic. As this terrorist showed us, he attacked the heart of democracy in Oslo. So, what was the question? I have forgotten.
But if you think about why haven't we heard about it? Why is this part of the history so?
Yes, why don't we know more about this, although it affects us?
Because we're talking about the importance of talking about the history and look back to look forward.
There are of course several reasons for that, but I mean, one main reason for the first history lesson of the Second World War, that was the Nuremberg trials. And the Nuremberg trials were very important in a lot of ways, but they were also very politically colored by the agendas of the different states. The Soviet had one agenda, France had another, US had a third, and Great Britain had a fourth. So this colored the trials, and through the way they dealt with it, they also left important parts out of the trials. So as this was the first history lesson, the first time we sort of collected what had happened, what they didn't bring up, for political reasons for instance, was left out for a long, long time. And so this is part of how we have built in oblivion. And I mean, the Jewish fate was very much, I mean, a large part of it was forgotten actually during these trials, not to mention the fate of homosexuals or of the Roma people. They were completely left out. So this is why we still have to deal with this part of history. It's not over, we're not ready with it yet.
When I listen to you two, I wonder if it's possible to create a history where everyone participates in the writing of the history in the society. What do you think? Is that possible? Is it possible that everyone?
Well, if everyone should participate, first and foremost, they have to somehow be invited in. And I think that is a responsibility we have as a society, that we dare to talk about also the difficult parts, and to be able to do that we have to invite those that do have opinions that are not the mainstream, or that's one part. I think I just want to follow up a bit what you said about the history of these elements and ideologies. A major part of the ideology and the mindset of the 22nd of July terrorist was the hatred against the Norwegian labor movement. And that is, so you have this core identity of Nazism and fascism, but then it takes different identities in different countries and societies. And in Norway, the underspoken hatred, which you see flourish, I would say also in society now, is also the hatred against the Social Democratic Party, which are seen, as traitors basically. And that is, that thought were quite, fitted in with the thought that, Eurabia theory, that the Muslims are taking over Europe. And in Norway's case, in the ideology of the terrorists, that was the Social Democratic Party that really was responsible for that. So I would definitely say that we have so much to learn about history, and it's important to do it. But to try to answer your question, what we'll do at Utøya also today is to invite people in on their terms, to talk about what matters to them, why it matters, what are they involved in, and not pinpointing only to the difficulties and the controversial issues, but to try to deal with them in a manner that opens up for us as a society to have those conversations. And I know, there's no fixed answer to how to do it, but to have those conversations are crucial, and to have them often enough also, because if we want to create, let's take 22nd of July as an example, if we want to create a scar on our society, because such an events should be, in my opinion, scar on our kind of collective identity, not a scar so we should be able to move on, but a scar to remind us that there will always be people that are willing to use force, are willing to use violence to achieve their objectives. And therefore, looking into history, looking into our present, that is a reminder why those conversations are so important.
And how can you do when it comes to the history of the history then?
Well, in a way we see it happening. We see people telling their stories, telling their grandparents' stories or their parents' stories. But there are still a lot of untold stories. And also, I mean, the problem with this is that now, I mean, talking and telling stories is only, it only works if someone is prepared to listen. Because it's in the listening the real healing actually occurs, I think. I'm not a psychologist, but I think that's sort of a basic truth. So this is something we all can contribute to by being listening, by also making sure that these stories are told, but also heard. So, but this is all very general. I can't help thinking about, I happened to be invited to South Africa before the pandemic, and there is a great tradition there of telling stories of what one have been through and what your family and people have been through, which is admirable and a very strong force in the healing. But the problem with South Africa, I would say, is that they didn't take the perpetrators and demand responsibility of them. They wanted to go on too quickly, and there should be a kind of atonement directly without people having to take responsibility for apartheid. And that means that a lot of anger is still left in society. So part of moving on from a trauma is also letting this anger take place. And it's not a pleasant process. Anger is a scary and unpleasant feeling. But I think we can't skip that part of this history.
If we want to have a good and well-functioning society where we let everything like this talk about it and listen to people, who is responsible for that? What do you think? Who are?
Well, the obvious reason is, of course, that we all are. But I mean, I think of all work within a democracy. I think of as, now what is the English word for it? I'm not sure. Stafette, you know. What is the English word?
Passing on.
Passing it on, because the same people can't be in the front all the time. So we have to exchange responsibility. That's the...
Yeah, and to be able to do that, it is also a generational perspective.
Yeah.
You have to put new generations in a situation where they're able to to take that stafettpinne, to take that on, to take and there in my instance, I have written a book also about some people I didn't know. I know them now, the families, but also to write about people that are no longer there that I didn't know personally. But you have to give new generations also a possibility to bring stories of people they didn't know on, because if not, they are forgotten. And that goes for individuals, but I think it also goes for history itself.
But could I just ask you, what is your vision? Will your work be over one day? And what have you achieved then when it's over? What do you see as the goal of it?
The first thing, I think, Alice Greenwell of the 9/11 Memorial and Museum in New York, she told me that the work you're now doing, Jørgen, you can relate it or you can see it as a pregnancy. So it's a tough job to be pregnant, but the really job starts when the child is there. And somehow this work of rebuilding Utøya, reclaiming Utøya, it's a tough process. We had to deal with a lot of conflicts, a lot of different opinions of how to commemorate, how to deal with history on the island, physically and in a broader sense. But then, the new structures are there, the memorial is there, people have moved on. Still, the work really starts when new generations have to take that responsibility, when new generations have to learn the history, and new generations have to be put in a situation where they have the tools to create a tolerant, open society, a democratic society where extremism and fascism is not it's accepted and not something young people are invited into.
We've been talking about rebuilding or not rebuilding, but can you actually tell us what happened? Because you both rebuilt and didn't.
Well, we wanted to first and foremost uphold our principal view that terror and violence should never win. And in this instance, the perpetrator wanted to shut down Utøya as a place for the Social Democratic Youth Party. It wanted to kill off an entire generations of young people. So not allowing him to succeed in shutting down the heart of the youth organization was crucial. And then in a more broader sense, we cannot abandon, we cannot leave places that hurts. We cannot say that it's too painful not seeing it. We have to find a meaningful way forward. And to be able to do that, we had to talk to expertise around the world, and we had to talk to each and every one that lost a child, lost one of their loved ones, and talking to the survivors. And doing that, we were trying to find this balance, a balance of Utøya as a place, the balance between the past and the future, a balance between to be a place of the most serious issues we have in our society, but also to be a place where we inspire new generations, inspire them to engage in society, to talk to each other, to have respect for other people's opinions. So the word balance goes, and now Utøya is a place where thousands of people every year come, from Norway, but also from Europe and the rest of the world, come to discuss, come to agree and disagree, to come to commemorate. But first and foremost, they come to a place where hope never lost, where the hope of what we as individuals do is what defined us as a society. And that is the role we wanted Utøya to have, and I definitely think that is the role Utøya has today.
You have written about, because this is one way to deal with the trauma for a lot of people, how we're going to move forward, and you have written about that. How can you end a trauma? And you were talking a little about it about South Africa, but how can you end a trauma that leads through generations?
Well, I mean, I think the word scar is a very good word in this context, because a scar is a kind of memory of something very painful, but it's also a sign of something that has stopped. It's not an open wound anymore. So somewhere there, now there's a lot of metaphors in the air, but what I did in my latest book is to try and understand my own family and to pinpoint the secrets and the lies and the trauma that has created this, because it's affected individuals. And this is what happens, I think, when you don't put words to pain and traumas. You leave them there unspoken, unnamed, and that's when they travel on to the next generations and affect them. Like children always are aware of secrets in a family, even if they don't know what secrets there are, but there's something there, or shamefulness or traumas. So my strategy, but I'm a writer, I work with words. My strategy is, of course, to put words to as much as I can, and in that way make things tangible and make them visible, because it's what's left in the dark, it's what we don't talk about that is the dangerous stuff, because it affects us, but we're not sure what affects us and how. We need to name it. It's a part of making the world possible to change, I think. So that's my very long answer to that.
No, but I understand.
I just want to follow up, if I can. The symbol of what you're talking about is the cafeteria building on Utøya. And also the learning process we had to deal with, and the reflections of how you should deal with not only words, but physical wounds. So this building is the only building that was affected on Utøya on the 22nd of July. All the other killings took place outdoors. And outdoor nature somehow heals itself. Life goes on. But inside, the bullet holes in the walls, time stood still. And the only thing that would change that was our decisions. And the first decision we took was to demolish the entire structure. Take it away. It's too painful to deal with. We wanted, to go forward as a society, forward as an organization, forward as a place. But as we talked about, and we have talked about now, to take it away, to just, this is not to be dealt with. It is not a good solution, I think, for finding a meaningful way forward. So what we have done instead is to keep this space, keep those rooms, keep these places where 13 young people were shot and killed, where you have the physical wounds in the walls. But it's now included in a new structure, a very fascinating building, but is also a place where we tell the stories of 22nd of July, and also a place for what we call a democracy arena, democracy workshop. It's a place where young people come to discuss these issues, with history basically in the walls next to them.
Yes, because you have the signs of the people not alive and the people that still are living, and that was in Utøya, in these pillars and the construction of the building.
Yes. So the structure itself consists of 495 pillars, one for each survivor. And all those survivors are standing around, taking care of, protecting the memories, but physically also 69 bigger columns that reach towards the sky and carrying the new roof. So it symbolizes many things, but it's a very concrete example of how we cannot let the past be the past. We also have to bring the past with us into the future.
And I think that's the last words in this talk. Thank you so much for your insights in this difficult matter. Elisabeth Åsbrink, author, and if you haven't read her books, I highly recommend you to. And Jørgen Watne Frydnes, CEO of Utøya. And here I recommend you have both written a book, and you also had a summer talk in NRK the 22nd of July this year. Now we're going to listen to the meditation of some other words, you can say, important for a lot of people and truly historical. And with that, I say back to Stockholm and Malin.